Alright, so in the last one we got the engine completely assembled, ready to go. Now obviously I need a way to transmit all that power to the rear wheels, so gotta put a transmission on this thing. Now with JZ swaps, there's a lot of options for transmissions to go with, and honestly cost wise they're all about the same. So you're really mostly looking at like what's going to be the easiest to fit in your chassis and what's going to hold the most, your goal for power. Now if you're looking to make like over like 800 horsepower, you probably want to go something like a CD009 or like a T56. Personally, my goals are relatively low. I'm keeping right now stock horsepower, but I'm only really planning to ever push this thing to like maybe 500 at most. So what I decided to go with is on the same thing that my buddy's been using in his Chaser, which makes like close to 500 horsepower as it is, which would be a brand new from Toyota R154 transmission. The main reason I went with this one instead of a CD9, aside from just the power, is because of the simplicity. Because obviously, already got a bell housing made for a JZ. This is the most standardized design of transmission for Toyota trans tunnels and whatnot. So I do need to do a little bit of clearancing around this stuff, but for the most part everything fits up just fine. And then one of the nicest things about it is that I don't have to make sure to remember exactly what model of clutch or anything that I need to use. I can just use a Toyota R154 clutch. And obviously there's a lot of different options for those you can go with too. For simplicity's sake and also budget's sake, I ended up going with this drift motion kit. So they got a lightweight flywheel, 6-puck, ceramic, whatever, composite material disc. And then this is the, I believe, stage 3.5, I think is the one, pressure plate. I'm pretty sure they said it was rated for around 600 horsepower, so plenty for what I'm trying to go with. And then obviously just everything I need to adapt it to the engine and transmission. Also, luckily they supply, they have options on their website for flywheel bolts, pressure plate bolts, and even transmission bell housing bolts, because being that I don't actually, I didn't rip this out of a car or anything, I don't have any of the hardware for it, so got all new hardware for that, so I got everything covered as far as that goes. So now I'm going to go ahead and get all this stuff assembled, get the throw out bearing installed on the clutch, so I can get the flywheel installed on the engine, along with the pressure plate, and then get the transmission on there. And then we'll put this thing into the car and start getting everything plugged up to it. All right, now before we stick that into the car, let's talk clearancing for this specific swap into this specific chassis, because obviously the 2JZ is pretty similar to the 5M, so it fits more or less okay. Twin turbos, a little bit different, and then the R154, it's a pretty beefy transmission, Toyota transmissions considered. So for starters in the trans tunnel, So I kind of assumed the bell housing was going to be bigger than it really was. So I clearanced both sides up here. You really don't need to clearance the passenger side because it clears just fine. There's plenty of space without clearancing this. However, on the driver's side, you need to clearance this kind of whole area because this is where the clutch slave cylinder sits, and you're going to want to have a little bit of extra room for that so you can get to the bleeder and everything, right? Now, the major issue that you're going to run into is where the little center plate of the transmission is. You're going to hit right here, and you're going to hit right here, and you're going to hit a little bit at the top as well. So I just clearanced kind of this, this whole area, and just a little bit around the corners. Going towards the back, you're really not going to have a whole lot of fitment issues side to side, but if you're using the specific shifter that I'm using, which is the JZX 110 shifter, it sits back pretty far. And unless you want to have your engine sitting right up against the core support, which I don't think you do, you're going to need to cut a pretty massive hole right behind where the shifter hole would be. Luckily, for me, this is just a drift car and I don't care to cut it up. But if you're keeping, more or less stock, interior Cressida, you're not going to want to do that. So you're going to want to find I think a Mark III Supra shifter would fit in that hole pretty well. And then I also went ahead and clearanced right here just a little bit because the transmission sits kind of high up and it'll be sitting right up against this for the most part. So I just kind of beat that up just a little bit and added some stripping to help prevent cutting myself randomly for no reason in the future. And then inside the actual engine bay, you don't really have to clearance all that much, to be honest with you. But if you're running the twin turbos, something I really kind of failed to think about until I fit the engines for the first time. Obviously, the back of this turbo sits pretty far, back, kind of level with the back of the engine. And these cars have this massive hump on the passenger side where all the AC boxes and stuff would go. Luckily for me, I don't really have any of that stuff back there, so I can clearance as much as I need to. So I had to pound the crap out of this whole section. You can see this used to all be more or less level. I had to beat this in by 3 or 4 inches almost. You're gonna lose this mount for your brake line and everything. So keep that in mind if you want to keep a twin turbo assembly on a 2JZ swap into this car. You're gonna have to clearance a lot right here. But yeah, like I said, that's pretty much all you have to do, luckily. So let's go ahead and get this thing in, and we'll go over a little bit more specific details for other fitment issues. Alright, with the engine in the car, like I said, there's a few more clearance issues that are unrelated to the chassis so much as the engine placement. So due to the location of not only the twin turbo intake tube back here, but also the fact that my shifter is already 3 or 4 inches back from where it should be, the engine kind of has to sit pretty far forward comparatively to where it used to be. So there's a pretty good amount of space between the firewall and the engine, which is kind of nice, but creates an issue up front where the radiator is. Don't worry about my zip ties. I promise you they're probably temporary. But as you can see, the distance between the radiator and the engine is minimal, to say the least. So you might be able to get away with putting a super thin fan in here, but personally, I don't really want to even try to risk it. So what I'll be doing instead is running 1 or 2 push fans right here. They'll sit between the radiator and where the intercooler will be up here. And then I'm going to have to cut a little bit more for my intercooler piping and all that, but you know, there's a whole lot of more plumbing and stuff that needs to be done in here. But as far as the electrical, I'm using the stock wire harness, so it sits right here, and usually there'll be a big box to fit the ECU. I'm literally just bolting it to the chassis. I don't recommend this, especially not for like a street car. Really should have this in a box, but as you know, this is all temporary because I'm going to go standalone ECU, full wire harness, everything else eventually anyway. So at that point, I'll mount it inside the chassis for now. However long it lasts is how long it lasts. But it's kind of nice that it didn't change a whole lot between 2001 and 1987, because this little diagnostic thing can just pop right on there. And then this takes a little bit more bending and stuff, but there's a couple bolts right here. If you bend these little ears just enough, this will bolt on right there. I'll get that on in a minute. The battery harness would probably be a stretch to try to get it to stretch, you know, far enough to put the, you know, get to the OEM battery location, but thankfully I'm not using that. So I got my main power wire going to the firewall right here. I'll do a big connection somewhere between it and all the other crazy big battery things I need connected directly to the battery somewhere. And obviously I'm gonna have to shorten my hoses for the radiator quite a bit to get that fit. I need to splice in the new connector for this because for whatever reason, back how long has it been? Four-ish years ago, when I was pulling this, I decided I would definitely never need the MAF sensor again, so I just cut the wire for whatever stupid reason, so I gotta splice a new one of those in. But other than that, shouldn't be all that complicated to get this all wired up and plumbed up and everything. Other than the radiator situation, there's plenty of room to work pretty much everywhere around here. Got the shifter all mounted up, and it's honestly not in too bad of a location for where I sit, so not worried about having to reach for it. Doesn't touch any of the siding, anything like that. I'm gonna have to make, well, I don't have to, but kind of make some kind of big boot to go around all this just to kind of keep smoke from coming up inside. And then I got the clutch all mounted up and bled as well, so got clutch. And I don't know if it's just because of the length of this pedal or what, but this honestly doesn't even feel as hard as like a stock clutch, so I'm pretty sure this clutch can hold quite a bit of pressure. But luckily I'm not gonna be killing myself, breaking my leg, clutching in and out. And you've seen it before in the brake video, but I didn't really mention it. So I'm using the Excessive MX-73 left-hand drive clutch pedal with the, I think it's like a Corolla or something, master cylinder that has, you know, studs instead of the use of bolts to bolt it in, so it works a lot better in this chassis, except for if you have cruise control, it won't fit, so bear that in mind if you're manual swapping a Cressida. And like I said, you're definitely gonna have to clearance this space for the slave cylinder, but you know, it's really not that big of a deal. It's only a little bit of spacing I get. I gave myself quite a bit for no real reason, but it will make it a little easier to get to the fill plug and stuff as well. But and then to mount the rear, luckily Excessive makes stuff that makes that a lot easier. So they got this cross brace for the rear mount, which helps a lot with positioning it because you got a lot of back and forward movement for these different bolt holes. You are going to want to use the rear two bolt holes. They're the only two you're really going to be able to reach. And this will be the I think type 4 or 5, whatever their transmission mounts. It's for the late model trans with the early model cross member thing. And I already got the drive shaft measured out and all the parts taken to the drive shaft shop to get a new one made. It's not gonna be done until next week, so I'm gonna have to pick it up at some point in time and install it. But if you are one of like the 1 or 2, maybe 3 people who is doing this exact swap, I'll save you some time. The measurement is gonna be about 48.5 inches from center line of the U-joint to center line of the U-joint is the measurement I went off just because I had the flanges in hand, but I'm sure it's only like an extra like 3 or 4 inches at most for the rear seal to the rear flange. And then as for speed sensors, because I'm going to be using the stock gauge cluster on this car. I really don't want to go with like a digital dashes or anything like that. It's rather just save my money. I'm actually going to be using the cable driven speedometer, which is what they normally use on like the W58 transmissions, but with R154s, almost every model that uses them uses a electronic speed sensor. But I think Mark III Supras use the cable driven one, and they're a pain to find all the individual parts and part numbers. But luckily Drift Motion sells the whole kit for the cable driven speedometer, so it just bolts in, has the gear and everything, and luckily the MX-73 cable just bolts right up to it. And you can kind of see how fitment is with all the clearancing I had to do. Not sure how well that'll pick up on camera, but you can see just how tight it is right around the corners of this center plate. It's even worse over here because there's the little sensor wire and everything, but like I said, just pound in that corner just a little bit and should clear up just fine. I don't think I'm touching anywhere. I suppose I'll figure that out later, but these mounts are pretty solid, so I'm not too worried about engine and transmission movement while driving. And if you're super low, like I'm probably going to be, you probably want to run a oil pan guard, I think. I forget what the term they use on Access's website, but the oil pan does stick down just a little tiny bit lower than the subframe, and the transmission kind of in the same boat. I think the rear of the transmission actually sits a little bit lower than the front of the transmission. Not by much though, but you're definitely gonna have a little bit of clearance issues up front with the oil pan if you're running in the super low stance. I'm gonna have to figure out some new front coils, because even without an engine in this thing, with the setup I have up front, it sits so low that it's maybe an inch above the ground, and I think with the engine in it, it's probably gonna sit even lower than that, like maybe even almost hitting the ground. So yeah, I need some new front coilovers, swap those out with, otherwise this thing's like undrivable. The tire is like within half an inch of just touching the upper portion of the wheel well up front when it sits on the ground. Now one more thing, for if you're swapping a 2JZ in one of these cars, the stock throttle cable in these cars is super short. So when it sits over there behind the firewall, so this is even further out than it would be, it doesn't exactly reach to the throttle body connection, whatever you call that. So I'm pretty sure this is out of a Camry. It's like a 90s-ish model, like 92 or something Camry. I'll probably, if I look it up and remember exactly what model it came out of, I'll put it up in a caption or whatever. But this kind of, like, it works better. It's definitely long enough to reach it, but it's actually a little too long. So not only do I need to kind of route this around kind of weird, but also I need to extend this, because this needs to fit like more around here, because it will want to sit, like realistically this is where it would want to sit, maybe a little bit further back, but where it sits at, you know, right here, you're just constantly going to be pulling on, like it's constantly going to be like full open throttle, so won't exactly work with the stock cable bracket, but shouldn't be too hard to fabricate a new one that'll fix that issue. And fitment reveal. This thing is stupid low, like literally unusably low. Let me try to show you the subframe. This does no justice on camera, I assure you, but there is maybe an inch between the ground and my oil pan. I am not comfortable with that. So, like I said earlier, I need some new front coilovers. I'll figure that out before I hit the track, but I'm not going to drive like this, don't worry. I'm not about to destroy this engine over not wanting to find some cheap front coils. I'll run max heating rod if I have to. But aside from sitting insanely low, way too low for me to even be comfortable with, it's not too bad. Now, while I was doing all this, I was also starting the fuel setup. So that's all done too, for the most part. There's a little bit of tying up to do, but it's basically finished. And if you're curious, yes, that is a 1988 Civic wagon front bumper on the front end. It required a little bit of chopping up the stock bumper support, but I made it work just because I felt like it. I'm not the only person to run that bumper up, one of these types of bumpers on this car, but I guess I am one of them now. It's extremely crude, but it'll work. I don't like the way the stock bumpers work, so or look, so not running that. But all I got left to do now is a little bit of like intercooler, oil cooler type stuff, routing, a little bit of wiring. Like I said, I'm gonna have my buddy help me out with that when I'm in Charlotte, like a week before the event. By the time you see this video, I'll likely already be at the event racing, so wish me luck, but you know, everything's gonna be a little bit behind schedule, or not behind schedule, but behind actual timing of like current events. But yeah, it's starting to feel like a real car again, not just a shell with an engine sitting around and a bunch of parts, which is awesome. But that's gonna have to do it for this one. I gotta get ready to load this thing up onto a trailer to take it to Charlotte for some other modifications that I am not gonna be doing myself. So you'll see that in one of the next ones. But until then, if you enjoyed, leave a like, subscribe to see the next one, and I'll see you next time.